I made up my mind. I'm gonna be orthodox. Yay, welcome home, brother. Dude, he was talking about me. No, he was talking about me. I'm the real Orthodox Church. You split from me when you rejected the Council of Chalcedon. No, I'm the real Orthodox Church. You split from me when you rejected the Council of Ephesus. No, I didn't. Let's ask him then. Yeah. Who were you talking about? Honestly, I was talking about the Assyrian Church of the East, which is more ancient than either of you guys, and is truly faithful to the Council of Constantinople. Early Christianity was spreading rapidly across the Roman Empire despite being persecuted. It was led by bishops who each ruled over the church in a particular place. In the very beginning, there was a group of bishops over each church, but that quickly evolved into one bishop over each church, and that quickly evolved into one bishop over a group of churches in each region. The early church was decentralized, partly because of persecution, but the bishops all recognized each other and were accountable to each other. It wasn't like modern Catholicism with one bishop over all the others, and modern Catholics admit this is a development, and it also wasn't like modern evangelicalism with a bunch of bishops not accountable to each other, each going their own separate ways, except they're not called bishops and they tend to look like this. Wait, but if it was decentralized, how did they deal with heresy? Easy. A few bishops would get together in a synod to declare things heretical and agree to excommunicate all the heretics. Since there were different heresies in different regions, the synods that addressed those heresies were also regional. Until Constantine took over and made the entire Roman Empire Christian, and there was a heresy brewing in Alexandria, and the Bishop of Alexandria asks for help. So Constantine has a brilliant idea to unify his empire. He thought, what if I have a synod of all the bishops in the world to agree on what Christianity is for everyone? So he summons all the bishops at Nicaea for the first ecumenical council. For the first time, there was going to be a centralized authority over the entire Christian world. The Council of Nicaea has to deal with this popular pastor Arius who explains the Father and the Son in ways that are easy to understand. He says, since the Son is also called the Word, the Father created the Word and then created the world through the Word. So Christ is the greatest being God ever created. He's of a similar nature to the Father, and he is like God, but not truly God the way the Father is. Arius even wrote songs about it.
There was a time when the Word was not, there was a time when the Word was not.
Bro, that's heresy, said Santa Claus, punching him in the face. St. Nicholas wasn't alone in this opinion. Most of the bishops agreed that it was heresy, and after some debate, it was almost all of them. So Arianism was branded as a heresy, and the council produced the Nicene Creed to clarify the true doctrine of Jesus. It says the Father and Son are both equally God, and the Son is eternally generated by the Father, but not created by the Father because he's always existed. The Father and Son share the same nature because they have everything that makes God God, like being all-powerful, all-knowing, and eternal. Same nature in Greek is homoousios. Similar nature in Greek is homoiousios. It's only one letter, or one iota of difference, that's where the phrase comes from, but it made the difference between orthodoxy and heresy. So Santa Claus insisted that Jesus was homoousios with the Father. Yay, now the issue's solved. Just kidding. You see, back then, people didn't just automatically accept the decisions of a council, especially because this kept happening. We just had a council that declared Arianism a heresy. Well, we just had a council that rejected your council. Well, we just had a council that rejected your rejection of our council. Well, we just had a council that says anyone who rejects our council's rejection of your council is a heretic. Well, we just had a council that says you can all kiss my ass. Since councils were the highest authority, there was no way to force all the bishops to accept a particular council, except with another council which not everyone would accept. So places often switched between Nicene and Arian, and eventually Arians became the majority of bishops. As Jerome said, the world groaned to find itself Arian. The Nicene Christians were in a bit of an awkward spot. They couldn't be completely kicked out of the church, but they also couldn't kick the Arians out of the church. So what were they supposed to do? Why don't you just give up on the mainstream church and start a new church in your basement? No, why don't you just plant your own parallel Nicene bishops in the places that have Arian bishops? This is how a lot of modern churches solve disagreements, but both of these options were rejected by all the church fathers as the sin of schism. So instead, the bishops had to, no pun intended, keep playing institutional chess with each other. The solution came with a bishop named Athanasius. He was the successor of Alexander who had first raised the alarm about the Arian crisis in Alexandria. He was mocked by his opponents as the Black Dwarf. They said, "The world is against you." Then I am against the world. Athanasius realized if the Arians weren't going to accept Nicaea, he would have to beat them in debate based on the Bible. He said it didn't matter if they rejected the Nicene councils because scripture is sufficient to refute heretics, and he did refute them, again and again and again, until all the bishops were won back to the Trinitarian Christian faith, and Arianism only lingered amongst the Germanic barbarians. "That was so cool, dude, I'm your biggest fan," said a young bishop named Apollinaris. "Thanks. Look how anti-Arian I can be. So you know how Jesus is God, right? If he's fully God, he can't be fully human. He just has a human body, but no human mind. He's a divine mind with a human body, like a video game avatar. He could have done quantum physics as a baby if he wanted to." Wait, what? There were also some people in Macedonia who agreed with the Nicene Creed that the Father and Son are both God, but didn't believe the Holy Spirit was God. Clearly, the Council of Nicaea left some questions unanswered. You know what that means, don't you? We need a second ecumenical council. The Council of Constantinople condemned Macedonianism and Apollinarianism as heresies. The heroes of this council were the Cappadocian Fathers. They supported Athanasius in the Council of Nicaea, but they thought it needed some improvements. They modified the Nicene Creed to clarify that the Holy Spirit is God, and they insisted that Jesus was also truly human. As Gregory of Nazianzus said, that which is not assumed is not redeemed. In other words, Jesus needs to become everything that we are to heal everything that we are. So Jesus needs to have a human body, a human mind, and a human soul to heal our human bodies, minds, and souls. They also debated the Greek word hypostasis, which means something like an individual example of a nature. Athanasius had said that God was one hypostasis because there's only one individual divine nature. But the Cappadocians thought it was wiser to say that the Father, Son, and Spirit each have their own hypostases, because the persons need to be a bit more distinct so that the Son can have a distinct human nature that the Father doesn't have. They agreed with Athanasius, but they thought his language led to Apollinarianism by not making the Father and Son distinct enough. It didn't take long for the Council of Constantinople to deal with these heresies. The entire church accepted the councils of Nicaea and Constantinople, but different schools of thought began to emerge. They didn't disagree with each other, and they weren't different denominations, but they had slightly different emphases. You see, the Alexandrians had a slight preference for their local hero Athanasius in the Council of Nicaea, whereas the Antiochenes had a slight preference for the Cappadocian Fathers in the Council of Constantinople. The Alexandrian school focused more on the divinity and oneness of Christ, whereas the Antiochene school focused on the humanity and two-ness of Christ. This was because the Alexandrians were more scared of Arianism, whereas the Antiochenes were more scared of Apollinarianism, which was an overreaction against Arianism. The Alexandrians interpreted the Bible as a more metaphorical divine text, whereas the Antiochenes interpreted the Bible as a more literal human text. So if you went to church in Antioch, the sermons would be something like this. Philippians 2 says, even though Jesus was God, he took on the form of a servant. This means you should be willing to serve others in your life as well. Whereas if you went to church in Alexandria, it would be more like, Philippians says, even though Jesus was God, he became a servant. This refers to how in the person of Christ, the Godhead took on human flesh and physical matter in order to sanctify it, and he serves us by bridging the gap between the infinite creator and the... So even though this difference wasn't a huge problem at first, it would soon lead to two major schisms. The last Apollinarians left liked to say that Mary was the mother of God, because they thought Jesus was just God wearing a human costume. And the Patriarch of Constantinople, who was a radical Antiochene, very scared of Apollinarianism, did not like that. His name was Nestorius. He explained Mary's just the mother of Jesus' human nature, so it's more accurate to call her the mother of Christ than the mother of God. Bro, that's heresy, said Cyril, who was Pope of Alexandria. Back then it wasn't just the Bishop of Rome that was called a pope. So now you have a major leader of one school calling a major leader of another school a heretic. You know what that means? We need a third ecumenical council. Nestorius and his followers were radical Antiochenes, so Cyril was able to turn the more moderate Antiochenes against them. Nestorius taught that Christ has two natures. The divine nature is called God the Son, the human nature is called Jesus, and Christ refers to the union of them. So if Mary's the mother of Jesus, you can call her the mother of Christ, but not exactly the mother of God. You can only call her that indirectly. Cyril said that's heresy because Christ is one hypostasis after the incarnation. If Christ is really one individual, you need to be able to use the names Jesus, Christ, and God interchangeably. If Mary's the mother of Jesus, you can call her the mother of God without any trouble. If you think that's even slightly improper, Cyril says you're splitting Jesus into two persons. Now, were the Nestorians actually saying Christ is two persons? No. They said Christ is one prosopon, which basically means person. They were saying that Christ has two knome. Knoma is a Syriac word, and they said the Father and Spirit each have their own knoma. This led many people to translate knoma as hypostasis, because everyone already agreed God has three hypostases, which could mean person. But in reality, knoma just means an individual entity. But this was suspicious enough for Nestorius and his buddies to be forced out of the Roman Empire and into the Persian Empire, where nobody could force them to accept the Council of Ephesus. They called themselves Church of the East, and the Ephesian Christians Church of the West. And this schism lasts to this day. The Assyrian Church of the East still exists, but sadly the only well-known person vaguely associated with it is this guy you might have seen on TikTok, but he's not a good representative because he's split from a group that split from them. But to this day, they lump Protestants, Catholics, Eastern Orthodox, and Oriental Orthodox all under the category of Western Christianity because they all accept the Council of Ephesus. So everyone loves Cyril because he was the hero of Ephesus. Oh wait, he's dead. So he gets replaced by Pope Dioscorus, who says, "Man, I'm so glad Cyril defeated the Nestorians and said Christ has one nature." "Wait, what?" said Pope Leo. "Wait, not that one, that one. Jesus has two natures." "No, Cyril said one." "No, Jesus is one person, but he has two natures. Cyril said one hypostasis, which means person. But it also means nature. Two natures is Nestorian." "No, it isn't." "Yes, it is." Time for a pope war, which means we need a fourth ecumenical council. The Council of Chalcedon was literally a debate over how to interpret the previous council. What did St. Cyril mean by one hypostasis? What did Cyril mean by hypostatic union? Leo said he meant a union of two natures in something else called a hypostasis, which implies hypostasis means person. This position is called diophysitism, or two natures. But Dioscorus said Cyril meant a union of two hypostases in one hypostasis, which implies hypostasis means individual nature. This position is called miaphysitism, or one nature out of two natures. Now, the Council of Ephesus did have a lot of statements that sound very Miaphysite, and Cyril himself believed in one incarnate nature of the Logos. Some people say that's an Apollinarian forgery, but what's definitely not an Apollinarian forgery is where he says, if anyone divides the hypostases after the union, let him be anathema, which implies the hypostases are distinct before the union, which implies hypostasis means nature. It's also very unlikely that Pope Leo would interpret Cyril better than his own students. Still, the council sided with Pope Leo because they thought the Miaphysites did not distinguish nature and person well enough. Still, the Miaphysites refused to accept Chalcedon because they said it clearly contradicted Ephesus. Chalcedon was a Nestorian council. No, it wasn't. Yes, it was. That's crazy. We're nothing like Nestorius. Hey guys, Nestorius? You're still alive? I just want to say I fully agree with the Council of Chalcedon. This was a complete disaster for the Chalcedonians. Because they looked so similar to Nestorians, the Miaphysites were able to convince more and more people to join their side, especially in the east. It got to the point where the Emperor Justinian was Chalcedonian, but his wife Theodora was literally a Miaphysite, so Justinian was motivated to modify Chalcedonianism to make it more reconcilable with Miaphysitism. So Justinian calls the Fifth Ecumenical Council, which is basically Chalcedonian damage control. After a century of fighting the Miaphysites, they're finally going to compromise and make sure they distinguish their view from Nestorianism. The reason it was so confusing is because everyone was using different categories. Chalcedonianism was more simple because it came from Pope Leo, who spoke Latin, which is a more philosophically simple language. They only had two categories, nature and person, so they could say Jesus has two natures and is one person. Easy. But both the Miaphysites and the Nestorians spoke a Greek which was more philosophically complex, so they each had three categories, one for general nature, one for individual example of a nature, and one for outward identity. They both agreed Jesus was from two general natures and had one outward identity, but where they disagreed was on the middle category. Was Jesus one individual example of two natures, or was Jesus a union of an individual human nature and an individual divine nature? So you can see how Chalcedonianism looks Nestorian from a Miaphysite perspective. The council clarified that Jesus is one individual subject, and therefore we worship Jesus as one subject. We don't worship parts of Christ separately. Some Eastern Chalcedonians tried to translate Chalcedonianism into the Greek three categories model, saying Jesus has one hypostasis and it's a divine hypostasis, but it hypostatizes or individuates the human nature. There's no separate individual human hypostasis that Jesus assumes, because that would be Nestorian. So it preserves the distinctness of the natures while also preserving the individual hypostasis. That's why we say technically Jesus isn't a human human person. He's a person who's truly human, but not a human person. He's only one person, and that's a divine person that has a truly human nature and a truly divine nature. So once they got that worked out, the Chalcedonians were able to win back many of the moderate Miaphysites. Yay, compromising with the Miaphysites is going well. What if we can think of one final compromise that will reunite us forever? The Patriarch of Constantinople has an idea. Two ideas, actually. Monoenergism and monothelitism. Monoenergism is the idea that Jesus' two natures perform one action, and monothelitism is the idea that Jesus' two natures share one will. And everyone loves this idea, including the Pope of Rome. We're closer than ever now to being one big happy Christian family and reuniting Christendom just in case a big new religion forms and tries to conquer us. One small problem. There's this one annoying monk, Maximus the Confessor, who just won't get with the program. He insists on dioenergism and diatheletism, meaning Jesus has two energies and two wills. He debates Pyrrhus, the Patriarch of Constantinople. Pyrrhus thinks that will and energy come with personhood, not with nature. This is also what the average modern person thinks. But Maximus thinks that will and energy come with nature. Just like Gregory of Nazianzus said, Jesus needs to become everything we are to redeem everything that we are. Jesus needs to have a human will and energy to redeem our human wills and energies. Pyrrhus thinks that's ridiculous. He thinks if Jesus has two wills and energies, they're going to be in conflict with each other. But Maximus assures him that there's no conflict between divine working and human working. And honestly, Pyrrhus's arguments are very similar to some pop Calvinists who believe in radical monergism. Monergism is not a historically reformed term, but it's very popular in pop Calvinism. It's similar to monoenergism because the basic idea is that God's action contradicts human action. That's why pop Calvinists act like God is completely active in our salvation and we are completely passive. But that's not the historic Reformed position. Historic Reformed and Calvinist theology sees no contradiction between God's full sovereignty and our participation in free will actions. Sadly, nobody listens to Maximus, and the church cuts out his tongue so he can't keep teaching his views. But he still didn't leave the church, so keep that in mind next time you want to leave your church just because it got a little bit woke. And then he dies. But after he dies, more and more people begin realizing that he was right. So the Sixth Ecumenical Council deposes Pope Honorius as a heretic and affirms dioenergism and diotheletism, and that will and energy come with nature, not with person. This is necessary to explain certain Bible verses, like Mark 6:5, where Jesus seems to have limited power. This only makes sense if he has a human energy distinct from his divine energy. Or Matthew 26:39, where Jesus appears to submit his will to the Father. This only makes sense if he has a human will distinct from the divine will. Because of this, the glorious reunion with the Miaphysites never happens. The Miaphysites are alive and well today as the Oriental Orthodox churches. But since Christendom is divided, when Islam shows up, it's able to conquer a lot of Christian lands very easily. Because of this, the non-Chalcedonian churches mostly faded into obscurity, and the Byzantine emperor was wondering why things had gotten so bad for Christendom. He said, God must be punishing us for venerating images. In the Old Testament, God punished idolatry by letting enemy nations conquer his people. So he ordered Iconoclasm, which means no images of God. Icons were removed from churches and replaced with crosses and Bibles. But many other people were like, dude, you can't take away our icons. Those are an essential part of Christian worship. So the question of whether icons were good or bad divided the church for over a century. The iconoclasts were able to show that iconoclastic tendencies were rampant amongst the church fathers. But iconodules like John of Damascus said iconoclasm is a denial of the incarnation because the invisible God became visible. Iconoclasts appealed to earlier church historians like Eusebius, who explained that many pagan customs were Christianized when Constantine converted Rome to Christianity, such as icons, altars, liturgical vestments, and incense. He said that ancient Romans would burn incense before an icon of their supposedly divine emperors, and Christians transferred that practice to Jesus. Modern Catholic scholars like John Henry Newman admit this is what happened historically, but they still agree with John Damascene's arguments for icon veneration based on Christology. Damascene says we can't depict the divine nature, but we can depict the human nature, so iconoclasm denies the humanity of Christ. The iconoclasts argued that iconodulia was Nestorian by splitting Christ's person into a nature you can't depict and a nature you can depict. Since Christ is one divine person, you can't depict him even if he has a human nature. Let's just have another ecumenical council. That'll solve this debate. We just had a council that bans all images of God. Yeah, well, I just called a council that rejects your council and says you'll go to hell if you don't kiss icons. Hey, Mom, don't you think that's a bit harsh? Oh, you don't like icons? How about I take your eyes out so you never have to look at them? You guys are both cringe, said Charlemagne. I just called a council that rejects both of your councils and says you can have images of Christ for teaching as long as you don't venerate them. And so the three sides fought well into the 800s, and it didn't help that they each had a council supporting them. Eventually, after centuries of bloody conflict, the iconodules emerged on top. But towards the end, the iconoclasts started criticizing other practices, not just icon veneration. They said we should stop praying to saints because that's also idolatry. If that sounds kinda proto-Protestant, it's because it is. Iconoclasm would persist in small pockets throughout the church for centuries following. Iconoclast theologians never stopped resurfacing. Now you might be wondering, were there any other ecumenical councils after this? Well, it depends who you ask. You see, after this point, people stopped agreeing on which councils to accept. To this day, every denomination has a different number of councils. The Assyrian Church of the East has 2, the Oriental Orthodox have 3, Protestants have 6, the Eastern Orthodox have 7, and Catholics have 21. And in the medieval church, groups kept resurfacing that didn't even accept Nicaea too. The Waldensians in the 1200s, the Lollards in the 1300s, the Hussites in the 1400s, and in the 1500s,